part of my vlog. I wanted to ask you about your area of work. You mostly work in the area of women development. When you say that, what is it that you mean, and what is a key challenge in this field?
In the field in which I'm doing research, which is gender and development, one of the key questions has been how have policymakers, bureaucrats, basically ministers, governments, those who make policies, economic policy, social policy, or national developmental policy, how have they perceived and understood the women question? That is to say, how have women figured in development policy making? Do they figure at all? Are they a presence or are they a conspicuous absence? Right? And in terms of, so we basically look at, say, development policy visions, statements. We look at the actual writing, the content of these statements, and then the working of these policies themselves to understand how adequately and accurately they reflect women's lives, women's lived realities. Is there a recognition? Is it adequate? Or is it a distorted reflection of women's lives and women's needs? So that's a key question. And to put it in an even more straightforward way, it has always been a struggle, for instance, for women to be valued, to be recognized, to be accepted as producers, as workers. I mean, simply as humans who have economic agency and value, as humans who are not just mothers and wives, but as agents who are contributing vitally to the household economy and to national economies, right? So the recognition by policymakers, by development policymakers, that women are workers, women are peasants, women are laborers, women are traders, and to push that understanding forward. So that's one of the key challenges in the field of gender and development research. So let me give you an idea of, let's say, just looking at the world post Second World War, right? In the years following the World War, if you looked at development policy making for third world countries or low income countries, you would find the development agent or the actor is always implicitly assumed to be male. So if it's a question of, say, improving farming techniques and outputs, then you provide extension, you as in the government provides extension services to the male farmer. And if it's the green revolution, a question of expanding agricultural output, then seeds, chemicals, fertilizers, new farming techniques are made available once again to the male farmer who is naturally assumed to be the head of the household or the representative of the house. Likewise, if it's a question of micro entrepreneurs, people managing small businesses, and the state wants to intervene here, what the state does is to provide business development services, to provide capital, to provide technology support, marketing assistance to male entrepreneurs, right? So therefore, this absence then of the recognition of women as economic producers costs women dear, right? And to come to the precise example of India, so we had these community development programs. That was basically our rural development programs for the first 2.5 decades after independence, right? Through much of the 1950s and the 1960s, in which we had village workers addressing women, reaching out to women primarily in their roles as housewives. So the kind of training the state would provide women would be training in home economics. That is cooking, childcare, well, maybe nutritious cooking, sanitation, managing the household better, sewing, embroidery. So the state's vision for women was to be better mothers, better wives, and better household managers, right? And this began to actually change only as late as the 1980s. So it was during the period of the 6th five-year plan. So that was between 1980 and 1985. That for the first time in the plan document, there was a chapter titled Women and Development. So until then, women were seen as the subjects of the social welfare department. So women were meant to be protected, to be cared for. So they were thought of as the vulnerable population, just like children were, just like the elderly were. This is a legacy that is clearly paternalistic. And while this has changed from the 1980s, this endures in many ways to this day.
You said there was a change. I was wondering, how did it change? And, was there a role of these women in bringing about this change?
So absolutely. For instance, on the one hand, there were networks of women researchers in first world countries as well, in advanced capitalist countries as well, who were producing tons of research showing that women are farmers. Women are working on family farms alongside the men of their households. Or in landless households, women are also landless agricultural laborers just as much as men are landless agricultural laborers. Or women are working in the non-farm sector. But that essentially, as you go down the income ladder, women are working because they have no other choice. They simply have to work to be able to put food on the table. The ILO, the International Labour Organization of the UN, undertook a series of studies in the 1970s on conditions of employment in developing countries. Right? And what the ILO finds is that a very major chunk of economic activity, economically productive activity, is happening in the informal sector. So the informal sector is hugely economically significant. And in the bottom rungs of the informal sector, most workers are women workers. So it's women who are working in the lowest tiers of the informal sectors as producers, as sellers, and women are pretty much invisible to development policy makers, but studies like the ILO studies start to make them visible, right? And so there is a huge amount of evidence that is being gathered from different parts of the world by different actors, which shows that women are therefore almost always equal contributors to household incomes. Often they are the primary earners, with men being supplementary earners. This is in situations of poverty especially. And in fact, men providing unreliable, irregular incomes, right? So a lot of research is also showing that in situations of poverty in a dual earner household, where the man and the woman are both working, the women's wages usually tend to be less because that's a reflection of how the economy works. But even in those situations, if the woman is contributing, as she tends to, 95% to 98% of her income to the family's survival, to its essential consumption needs, while the man may be contributing 60 to 70% of his income to the family's consumption needs, that makes the woman's contribution the vital one, the essential, the primary one for the survival of a household in poverty, right? So the cumulative effect of all this research shows that so far women have remained at the periphery, at the margins of policy making, of economic and development policy making, but that this will not do and that this has to change, right? And you also, of course, the story would be incomplete if we also did not acknowledge the role that women's movements have played the world over. So from the 1970s onwards, we've had women's movements in advanced capitalist countries, at the same time in third world countries. To take the case of India, we have women's organizations growing in strength, mounting very effective campaigns on issues such as dowry deaths, sexual assault, violence, but at the same time, forcing policymakers to recognize and acknowledge that women are producers too, that women are economic producers too. So there is that support that comes, and part of the message that women's organizations are giving governments is recognition is only the first step. After recognition, you have to reach development resources to women, right? For instance, to give you an analogy from our current times, there's so much recognition of the corona warriors, right? So that's doctors, health workers, nurses. So there's the showering of rose petals on them, the clapping, the banging of talis. All that is okay. I don't have a quarrel with that. But what is more important is to reach them protective gear, right? To make sure that they get tested regularly, to make sure that their service conditions are not putting their lives at risk. So recognition can remain empty unless it is followed up with effective resources. And that's precisely the same argument here. We recognize women's role as producers, but at the same time, we make sure that women get credit, meaning loans from the government, they get productive technologies, they get access to markets, and they get land in their own names if they are from farming households.
That is interesting because I recently had a conversation with one other friend of mine who is with this organization called Rang Day that works exclusively with female farmers. I was just wondering if you can give us examples of women asserting these rights, demanding these rights in Indian history context. This question is pertinent because when I was speaking with Rangde, we were also talking about landless laborers and the struggle of women agricultural laborers in the history when they had to really protest and demand their right to own a property, own land, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, we have very inspiring instances of the struggle of landless sections of India's population for land, for the right to land in an agrarian country like India. And some of these struggles have had two dimensions. So one dimension is when landless peasants and sharecroppers organize both men and women together to wrest land away from power holders, right? From landlords, whoever the rural power holders may be. But some struggles have also had the added dimension in which land has then been transferred to peasant communities, and within peasant households land has been transferred to women's names, right? So there is that additional component as well. This has been written about, published and documented fairly extensively, but I think it bears repeating again and again for the reason that these are very inspiring movements and we must continuously remind ourselves that we've had the legacy of such movements, and personally I found them very inspiring. One instance is that of the Bodh Gaya struggle in India, which took place in the late 1970s, in the late 1970s from 78 onwards. Bodh Gaya in the Gaya district of Bihar, where about 10,000 acres of land were owned by, monopolized by a Hindu temple. So the Mutt in this case was the most powerful landowner of this region. And Beena Agarwal, in her book on women and land rights in Asia, highlights this struggle in particular because of the way in which gender concerns were articulated within a land rights movement. So that makes it a very pioneering, iconic struggle for the Asian region more broadly. So what happens in the Bodh Gaya struggle is that the struggle is led by the Gandhian socialist organization, the Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Vahini, with J.P. Narayan at the lead, Jayaprakash Narayan at the lead, being one of the leading organizers. And after a heroic struggle in which mostly landless laborers and sharecroppers from Dalit and OBC households fight the Mutt for ownership of the land, about 1,500 acres of land are transferred in 1981. But then this raises the question of in whose name should the land be transferred. And as Beena Agarwal tells us, the Bodh Gaya struggle also had a very effective women's participation, solidarity amongst women, women's camps, mobilizational camps in which issues specific to women were foregrounded, such as, for instance, male alcoholism, domestic violence within families, the systemic neglect and bias against the girl child, even verbal abuse of women, and the right of women's voices to be effectively heard within the struggle itself, amongst the organization itself. So in the first phase of land distribution, when land was distributed to landless households and to sharecroppers, but primarily to men, and to women only when they were widows, right? So in that first phase, after that first phase, there was a change, there was a shift in understanding in the position of the movement. And this was because women activists, women peasants within the movement were then putting forward their case, saying that, look, we marched along with the men, we faced the lathis, we carried children in our arms, in our bellies, and then we came home to do all the work and the cooking. And yet when land was distributed, we were pushed aside. How is this fair? So then there begins a process of very intense dialogue and debate within the movement itself. And women have had to negotiate, women peasants have had to negotiate both within their households, with their husbands, and with male comrades within the movement, with male organizers, to make them see the justice of women's cause. Right? So, for instance, what is interesting is where the male comrades would say, but whose name does it matter? Then the women would say, well, if it doesn't matter at all, For one thing, the land could have just remained with the mutt. Why do we even struggle to get the land? But then we say the land must come to us. And then if it doesn't matter, then put it in women's name. Why argue about it, right? Why must be, dispute it, right? So they also found, women leaders and peasants within the movement also found that while their comrades were convinced and their husbands were convinced, government officials proved very, very stubborn. In fact, that was one of the bigger challenges, because the propensity, then the tendency, as I was telling you, for government to see only men as workers, as the natural head of the household, therefore, by virtue of being the worker, right? So government officials would sometimes simply refuse outright, saying, but it's men who plow the land. So how can you ask for the land to be in your name? And then women would say, but we reap the crop. And if we did not reap the crop, how would you even get the harvest? Right? So it was these negotiations that ensured that there was a struggle within a struggle. Beena Agarwal says that women are asserting their gender specific interests as distinct from men of their class and their community. Right? And women are, of course, asserting also equally and vehemently their identities as peasants, as workers, as sharecroppers, and thereby staking a claim to ownership of land. I think that shows us that when a struggle like this happens, it sort of pushes our collective social understanding outward in terms of what women are due, what their worth is, and what society owes them, therefore.
So has this victory been won after Bodh Gaya?
So in Bodh Gaya itself, there was various kinds of land redistribution patterns. Sometimes women would get joint pattas with their men, so their names would be in the patta, but the patta would be in the name of the man and the woman. In some cases, it would be independently only in women's names, even when the husband was alive and present. In some cases, women would inherit land as widows. So different things happened depending on what women were able to win for themselves. But I also want to then sort of take the story forward and say that this question, the larger question from the Bodh Gaya struggle, which is the question of resources for women, whether it's land, which is agrarian land, or it's homestead land, but to give women resources in their own name is a struggle that is sort of being fought and waged and won or lost in different parts of India through different people's movements. So it's not a struggle that is it's not a question that is finished, done and dusted. So it needs to be the principle of justice, of gender justice in this case, has to be reinvented, right? And it has to be claimed and staked and fought and then won, right? In very different ways, but in very specific contexts, in very local contexts. So it becomes organic to a particular area only when it is rooted in that struggle in that area, when it sort of mobilizes men and women from within that area, from within that locality. So let me give you examples of research I've been doing more recently. So I've been talking to women's organizations as part of this research and women-led trade unions. All of them working in Tamil Nadu and mobilizing manual workers in the informal sector, some of them organizing both men and women and some organizing only women workers. So to give you examples from here, there's the Pennurimai Iyakkam, which was formed in the late 1970s in Tamil Nadu and has been very active in some parts of Tamil Nadu, especially in Chennai and in Madurai. And one of the stories they shared with me, which I found very interesting, was about how in Madurai, when they were organizing, Pennurimai Iyakkam was organizing women construction workers who were homeless, basically, and had managed to convince the district collectorate, the collector's office, to give land pattas to the homeless poor in the areas in which they were organizing. So they were basically the mediators between government and the workers. The question then was, when the government was willing to give homestead land. So this was not a question of agrarian land or cultivable land, but homestead land. The question was, in whose names must the patta be made out? So Pennurimai Iyakkam, representing the women construction workers, put forward the claim that it must be in women's names, and they managed to get a row of houses from the district collectorate in women's names. And therefore the area itself was renamed Pennurimai Nagar. But this could not be sustained and men's names had to be added to the pattas because that was the negotiation within households. So this is just to give you an example of how this consciousness is something that has to be constantly created and recreated. But let me also then return to the theme that I began with, which is the theme of creating larger recognition, right? Whether it's policy recognition or social recognition for women's identities as workers. Because work really is the identity that has been taken away from women, or work-based identities are the identities that are denied women and have been, in a sense, stolen from women, right? So coming back to the case of these organizations, almost all of them work with women manual workers in the lowest tiers of the informal sector. So either they are construction workers or domestic workers or sanitation workers, and sanitation workers not even with the corporation on a permanent job, but as employed as contract workers. Or they are women working from within their households. So they could be women tailors or women who are doing tiffin sales. So they cook meals, they cook lunch, they cook idlis, and then they offer, and they sell within their neighborhoods. Or they're buying nighties and saris wholesale and they're selling it retail, right? Now the challenges that the unions face here is, how do we then convince the women who are not working in a formal organized workspace, right? So they're not working out of a workshop, they're not working out of an office, they're not working out of a factory. So where they're working is their own home or a street corner or somebody else's home, right? So in this informal, unorganized workspace, which could be your own domestic space, you still have to build the woman's consciousness of herself as a worker. So that's really the first step. And then she fights then with her family to acknowledge her identity as a worker. And then the fight sort of goes outward to making claims of society at large and then to governments. So here, this is important because convincing women that in a very legitimate sense they are workers would mean convincing the woman who is making papads and appalams from her home that she is a worker and she is entitled to claims and benefits as a worker. Now, why this is important is that woman in turn could be the lowest end of a chain linking to a company, maybe an export revenue earning company, which is selling that appalam or papad abroad or to huge markets in India. So it is in the interest of that company for the woman to see herself as nothing but a housewife. Oh, I'm basically a housewife. I just do this work on the side, but I'm really just only a housewife. I'm not really a worker. It's not even in the interest of that company for that woman to claim her identity as a worker, right? And therefore it becomes all the more important to challenge this consciousness at the level of the individual worker herself, her family, and then to take the fight outward as well. And also we must keep another dimension in mind, which is that this is a caste society, right? Where manual work of all kinds is downgraded and degraded. And some forms of manual work are stigmatized and considered particularly menial. And as it happens, it is where women are working as manual workers that the labor they perform is seen as the least skilled and the most menial, right? So you have therefore this interlocking of both caste hierarchy and gender-based hierarchies. And the effect of that is the derogation of women's work, right? Of women's work in particular. So this makes it particularly challenging for these trade unions and women's organizations to sort of break this vicious cycle of thinking and therefore of the kind of action that flows from this thinking, and to get women to claim with pride and to assert with pride their identities as manual workers in the lowest rungs of the informal sector. But something that has been working positively, and I just want to share that also here, because it's been an opportunity, and this opportunity has come by way of the formation, the setting up of the informal worker welfare boards, right? So just to explain that a little bit further, if you were an informal worker, now you have no social security, no guaranteed minimum wage, no security of employment, therefore no pensions. If you're a woman worker, no maternity benefits, and your children don't get access to educational scholarships. If there is a sudden death in your family, the worker dies, there's no funeral assistance from the government either. If there's an accident, there's no accident insurance either, right? There's no healthcare insurance. Now, all of this is what a tiny minority of organized sector workers have access to in India. And that's just less than 10% of, say, of India's population, right? So the setting up of informal workers' welfare boards has been an important positive first step, because it means that a worker, man or a woman, can register herself in this board as a worker, as a sanitation worker, a salt pan worker, maybe a domestic worker, construction worker, right? The registration is the first step. And then she gets her worker identity card, and then she makes a claim from the welfare board for either a pension or an accident insurance, or an educational stipend for her child, right? But the registration is the first step. And in Tamil Nadu, we've had, since the 1990s, we've had the Construction Workers Board being set up first, a Manual Workers Board being set up later, 99. In 2007, a Domestic Workers Board. So there are currently about 34 welfare boards for workers in the informal sector, for manual workers in the informal sector. Now, that has been used as an opportunity by the trade unions, by the informal sector trade unions, to reach out to a larger section of workers. Right? Because when you're trying to mobilize as a trade union, if you were a trade union trying to mobilize workers in the informal sector or workers in the formal sector as well, you would have to give them something to hope for. I mean, why organize? Why fight? Why join a union unless you have something that you can offer me? So with the formal sector, with the organized sector, the entry point for a union would be to say, well, if you join the union and struggle as a union member, we could ask for a pay raise, or we could ask for bonus, or for promotions, right? Or for the dearness allowance. Whereas for informal workers, there was no such thing. But now with the presence, the formation of the welfare boards, it becomes possible then, it gives a leverage, right? For the trade unions to then say, look, now that you have your own welfare boards, we must use these boards. Their financial resources must not lie unutilized. They must not go waste. So you must step up and identify as a worker and then register yourself with the board. So this becomes therefore an important first step for trade unions to get informal sector workers and women workers in particular among them to reach out to newer sections of women workers to identify as worker, register with the board, and then claim your resources as workers, right? And I also want to at this point give you the example of another organization from Chennai, the Pen Tholilalar Sangam, which shared their experiences with me. And what they have been doing is getting domestic workers in Chennai who are in different residents of various low-income areas and slums in the city, but reaching out to them, getting them to register with the board, with the Domestic Workers Welfare Board, but then also to take the next step forward, which is not merely to say, fine, now that you've registered, that's the end of the story. That's not the end of the story, but to continuously train them to claim their rights as workers from both private employers and from the state. Right? So that's part of the consciousness of building the identity of a domestic worker as a legitimate worker, deserving of self-worth, social respect, state support. Right? So with employers, for instance, it would be the organization Pen Tholilalar Sangam would train her to ask for one day off in a week, right? With her, to negotiate with her employers, to ask for a minimum wage of say 50 rupees an hour, a minimum wage. And then to ask for 1 month's wage as an annual bonus, right? And then to ask for dignity, dignified treatment from her employer, to resist and to report sexual harassment, right? And from the government, it would be to ask for affordable transport. It would be to ask for subsidized housing, right? So then building her sense that she has a right to stake her claim to state support, to dignity, to self-respect, right? And that's the important next step that follows from asserting her identity as a worker. So like I was saying, from the 1980s, we've had policy slowly shifting, recognizing women's agency as workers. It could not have shifted to the extent it has unless there was a groundswell of organizing efforts by trade unions, by women's organizations, women's trade unions on the grounds, also constantly fighting and pushing one step at a time.
So I was wondering, Kalpana, if you can talk a little bit about the policy changes by way of microcredit and self-help groups, since we hear about them so much, and it is women who get priority access to credit usually. Is that right? Is my understanding right?
Absolutely right. And what is interesting about the self-help group movement is that the self-help group phenomenon is that it's not women's identities as workers that is necessarily being foregrounded here, right? It's actually women's identities as very responsible savers and prudent borrowers. So it's the saving and the borrowing that tends to be the pivot of the self-help group phenomenon in India, but also the microcredit movement more globally. So, for instance, what is being emphasized here is the woman's sense of accountability, her accountability to herself, to her peer group members, basically her self-help group members, her co-members, and to her family, right? That she works hard, she saves hard, she repays her loans on time, she does not fall behind with loan payments because she is a responsible saver and she is a responsible and accountable borrower, right? So there are many interesting perspectives and opinions that one can have in terms of how one looks at the microcredit movement itself globally. You are absolutely right in that women, they have been the borrowers, women have been the members of this phenomenon globally, but some have argued, and I have also in my own work also put forward the argument that in a way the self-help group phenomenon in India and the microcredit phenomenon globally is a way of also making women the primary responsible agents for tackling household poverty, right? So it's not so much communities, it's actually women within families who now bear the brunt of the responsibility of mitigating, of alleviating household poverty. And sometimes it's women who have to step in and step up, even to compensate for state failure, for government failure, right? So what governments are not sufficiently doing, it's women who are now stepping up to do. So if governments are not providing, say, affordable healthcare, it's women's loans from within through the SHG that is used to pay doctors' fees. So if ration shops and the public distribution system is failing the poor by just not providing adequate rations to communities, women are now taking loans out of their SHGs and using those loans to meet the shortfall in food consumption of their households. In fact, I've done interviews with women SHG members. When I've asked them, so what did you do with the loan? They would say, we ate it. We ate the loan, right? So we just used the money to buy food, to buy vegetables, to buy meat. Right? And so the many ways in which the welfare state is actually failing the poor, the so-called welfare state, is not meeting the basic essential survival needs of the poor. Those could be those cracks that women in self-help groups are now expected to fill by saving and by borrowing and by repeatedly borrowing and repeatedly repaying their loans on time, right? So, but having said that, I would also want to make the case that at least in India, we have women self-help groups that are being linked to the nationalized banking structure, right? That is to say the public sector banks, the government-owned banks. So I would see that as a positive step, unlike, say, our neighboring country, Bangladesh, in which women microfinance borrowers are linked to private sector microfinance institutions. And that's a completely different story, a completely different ball game, and I don't want to go there. But let's just stick with the self-help group story, which is this bridge that is developed between women and the nationalized banks and the public sector banks. So one way in which I've always seen self-help groups is to also see them as grassroots collectives, a union of sort, if you like. They often call themselves sangams, right, that are knocking on the doors of the banking sector, right, and are sort of giving banks a message saying that you could ignore us earlier when we were not organized, when we were individuals, but you cannot ignore us anymore now that we are organized and we are a collective, right? So it's women from low-income households, women from land-poor households who are sort of from the bottom up making demands on the banking sector, right? Who are placing their democratic aspirations for low-cost credit. And that's a valuable development resource, right? Low-cost credit. Low cost, obviously, from the banks with respect to the money lender's credit. So it's low cost in keeping in mind that vis-a-vis. So vis-a-vis who? The money lender within the rural community. So women are now organizing to say we want that credit in our names through our groups, and we are organized and we won't take no for an answer. And whether you like it or not, you have to do business with us. You have to give us loans. So there is that democratic aspiration of women from rural poor and working poor communities that I see as a positive sign. And therefore, I do also see SHGs as part of India's policy movement in the direction of recognizing women as economic producers, right? So, to that extent, yes, I do see it as a progressive move, and I'm not denying that at all. I don't want to take that away. In fact, I want to foreground that here. But then once again, having said that, I want to complicate the story a little bit further by saying that a development resource like loan, like credit, like a loan is something that you have to repay. So, you had the end of say 8 months or 9 months, and you have regularly, sometimes weekly repayment, sometimes fortnightly, sometimes monthly. So it's a commitment to repay, right? And we do have stories of women facing the burden of repayment, often sometimes with little support from their households. So it's a question of you took the loan, you repay the loan. And if a woman is unable to keep up her loan repayment commitments, then she loses face amongst her fellow members in the group. And usually there are women who talk about how towards the repayment date in the month, there's the woman of the family consumes less food, the family buys less meat and eggs and vegetables in order to somehow, put that money together to meet the repayment, whether it's the repayment to the group or to the bank, right? So those stresses and strains are very much a part of the logic of microcredit, which also make it problematic at one level, and we can't wish that away. And on the other hand, also, there is the question of the struggles that women's self-help groups have had to endure to even get that damned loan in the first place from the bank, right? So it's not easy, it's not smooth. While on policy, on paper, it sounds very smooth. A group has been in existence for 6 months, it's been saving its own money, rotating its own capital, and then it's got a bank account and it can approach the bank and get a loan. But the story is far, far more complicated than that. And women have often had to chase bankers endlessly, spending a lot of their time, their labor, their resources in order to get that loan. I've written a lot about it elsewhere, and maybe we can talk about it some other time, but it's also a part of the story which makes microcredit a promise for women at the same time as it makes it a bit of a problem also for women.
True. The repayment has always been a concern. I think that's why maybe organizations like Rangde, who are offering interest-free loans for eligible members, especially women agricultural laborers, at a time like this, seems like a very worthy, noble endeavor. Even though it is a for-profit organization, they are figuring their own way out. But at the moment, to rid the women of the interest that they have to pay, the burden of interest that they have to pay on the capital that they borrowed is in itself a huge burden off their shoulders. And that was a fabulous conversation that we had right now, Kalpana. I hope that a lot of people find it beneficial and will take it upon themselves to spread this information by sharing it with the people that they have been working or they know might be suffering or might be having a bit of challenge, especially at times like this.